Hello, we're going to talk about Chapter 11 today. It's talking about women in prison. So there's different types of ways that women can end up in prison and jail. So custodial is simply housing women, typically like in a jail where they've been arrested and then you house them. This is typically popular in southern states, which is also where the largest plantations are. So there's an argument related to where plantations are and where custodial jails and prisons are, and that's there's a correlation between that and in southern states. They don't offer much programming or treatment for women, and women of color were more likely to be housed in this type of institution than their white counterparts. A lot of times, jails and prisons, even at the federal level, often don't have programming or treatment for women because they're like the population is so small. Why should we offer programming or treatment for women? We're going to offer programming and treatment for men because the population and the percentage is so much higher. Reformatory is defined as opportunities for women to get treatment, and they tend to have female guards and be more female focused to help women change their lifestyle and become productive members of society. So they would have treatment that is gender focused. They would have programs that are gender focused. And in this case, if we go by race, white women are more likely to be housed in reformatory model institutions as opposed to women of color. Women of color, again, as the previous slide suggested, were custodial, and white women have a more reformatory model. So here are some examples of what jails and prisons look like in other countries. So the first video, most of these videos are about European countries where they have programs and resources and counseling for all people involved in the criminal justice system that are in prison or jail, and thus their recidivism rate is much lower when they return to the public or society. So why do women go to prison? Sentencing policies such as mandatory minimum and the war on drugs, as we talked about the war on drugs a couple of lectures ago, are strict and increase the amount of time that women spend in prison. Now, since President Obama's 8 years, mandatory minimums have decreased. The difference between crack and cocaine, powder cocaine sentencing is decreased, but a lot of times judges still have to fall at mandatory minimum. And we know that race plays a role in the mandatory minimum, family structure plays a role, social class plays a role in getting less in the sentencing policy or getting more in the sentencing policy. So we know from Al Benetti at University of Iowa, who did a study about juveniles, that if a juvenile was white, appeared to be middle class, and came with an intact family, therefore two parents who are looking after the juvenile, that the juvenile would get the lowest sentence possible. Whereas if any of those other characteristics were lower on the hierarchy, they would get more than a minimum sentence. So what are the demographics of women who are incarcerated? Women of color are more likely to be incarcerated at a higher rate than white women. This is also true for men. Men of color are also incarcerated at a higher rate than white women. White women are more likely to be arrested for property crime. Women of color are arrested for both violent and drug-related offenses. Many women in prison have a limited amount of education and vocational training, and this goes back to if you weren't doing well in school. This also explained by some theories that we talked about earlier in the semester, and lower socioeconomic or poverty also increases women who are incarcerated. Also, cognitive behavior issues. A lot of times women and men will have a mental health diagnosis or illness, and this there will be increases in prisons and jails. The city of Chicago, for example, the last figure came out that 90% of men in some kind of prison from Chicago or in Chicago had a mental health illness or diagnosis. So, tell me about the Eighth Amendment and what it means and what it determines and how it impacts. So here's a discussion question. So I will post on Blackboard where you can upload what you think the discussion question should be or answer should be. If you were to build a women's prison that reflected gender responsive principles, what key features would you integrate into your facility? What discuss the profile for women who are incarcerated in our prison facilities. In what ways are incarcerated women different from incarcerated men? And what challenges do incarcerated women face? How does prison impact the children of these mothers?